If you've ever played Kingdom Hearts 2, which I'm assuming you have if you're watching a Kingdom Hearts focused channel run by someone whose whole persona is based off of a character introduced in KH2, you've probably played around with drive forms at least once or twice. Powerful forms that Sora can shift into by using a resource that essentially changes the combat flow in how you go after the Heartless. Valor form, wail on the enemy. Wisdom form, spam magic or keep your distance with ranged attacks. Final, end everything on screen with a couple presses of the button. The way they introduced this was done so masterfully as well. While Roxas wasn't using a drive form when he pulls out Oathkeeper and Oblivion, this was how Kingdom Hearts 2 introduced the new combat system. We went through a tutorial that quite literally mirrored the feeling of Kingdom Hearts 1 before flipping those mechanics on its head by introducing 2 Keyblades and later on movement abilities. Both these concepts completely changed how one interacted with the game. Drive forms can be triggered to change the flow of battle or to increase your damage in a fight. With future installments in the franchise, different mechanics replace drive forms, still though with the same idea of changing the flow of battle or increasing damage. Limit breaks, command styles, style changes, Link and dual styles, the clock program, and form changes. These mechanics all have the same idea of encouraging the player to engage during battle. Kingdom Hearts 1 was a very basic gameplay flow where you attacked as often as you could to build up your MP gauge and use powerful spells as limits. From Kingdom Hearts 2 onwards though, the focus was still on attacking, but more so around which forms would be best to take on the current battle. It was almost like each game added on a trump card you could use. Throughout each title, subtle changes were made to this mechanic, and I want to talk about how this evolved and changed throughout the franchise. Hi, if you don't know me, I'm Bio-Roxas. I love diving into mechanics as well as animations and looking at why games look and feel good. You've probably seen me make a ton of breakdowns on form changes, drive forms, command styles, you name it. So I thought, hey, why don't I give my idea on how the evolution of combat has changed throughout Kingdom Hearts. So come with me as we look at the evolution of forms in Kingdom Hearts combat. I think anyone who played Kingdom Hearts 2 will probably tell you their favorite battle mechanic was drive forms. This acted as an elixir, refilling both your MP and HP, while also giving you a boost to your attack power by allowing Sora to wield a second Keyblade. Alongside Keyblades, Sora would also go into a form that allowed for unique abilities to be used during combat. Now, I don't want to go into a whole retrospective of drive forms, I'm sure you have a general idea of it, but I'll give a brief rundown. Some allowed Sora to automatically skip to finishers, and some allowed him to power up his magic. As you play with these drive forms, they can be leveled up, allowing you to be in them longer, as well as increasing the effectiveness of the growth ability attached to that form. Each drive form had a specific movement ability that could be refined the more you leveled up each form. So there was an extra incentive to work on each drive form, as you could increase your base kit with Sora by leveling each one up. You had a high jump, 2 versions of dodging, a double jump that parried most attacks, and a glide ability. Each drive form also had its own unique combos that were added, and each subtly changed up the playstyles. Valor form was just straight up damage, locking out your magic but boosting your attack speed with strong combos and combo finishers. It also had a ton of parry frames, which made it good for almost any situation, letting you spam your combo and follow up with counterattacks if the enemy happened to break free for a second to attack. It's also great for clearing out loads of small Heartless mobs since you can jump straight to the combo finisher and blow through them. Wisdom form is good for staying back away from enemies to deal with damage, as well as significantly boosting the power of your magic and the speed at which you cast. Limit form is good for staying alive since each of the limits regain your HP during their attacks. It's also a great dose of nostalgia since the attacks stem from the original game. Master form to me always felt like it did really well against single enemies, like bosses or big enemies, though there are attacks geared towards crowd control as well. Final form is incredibly powerful and feels more like an endgame form made to be OP, rather than being geared toward a specific playstyle. Now, all these forms can pretty much break the game. If you've seen a challenge or speedrun, you can see how insane these drive forms can be, and how fast they can melt a boss. To combat potential spamming of these drive forms, the developers added a hidden counter that would increase as you use these forms. There's a ton of nuance to this counter, like certain fights multiplying the hidden counter, or getting a new drive form resetting the counter, but essentially the higher it got, the more likely you would trigger a unique form called anti-form. This is a glass cannon kind of form where you had these really powerful attacks and combos that staggered enemies pretty easily, but you couldn't use your command menu except for attack, and your HP couldn't be regained while you were in this form. Damage taken was increased, and when you finally did come out of the form, your drive gauge was reduced to 0 regardless of what you had. Anti-form was the devs' way of making sure you didn't spam drive forms, but the confusion of not really understanding why anti-form was sometimes triggering and sometimes not, kept some from using this mechanic altogether. Add on to that the fact that when this game originally came out, the drive gauge built up more slowly than the Final Mix counterpart, kinda drove a lot of people away from using this often. I don't know if you're like me, but if I have any kind of usable resource and I don't know how much it'll cost to replace, I just won't use it. High potion? Elixir? What if I get to the final boss and need all 99 elixirs that have hoarded this entire game? So yeah, the drive forms are powerful, yet it was only used in the most dire of times. I think devs knew that this would kind of be used as a second chance-esque mechanic, which is why they added auto abilities to trigger when you were low on health. So to me, drive forms were more of like a second chance or last chance mechanic rather than being used to actually engage in the combat a lot. I think the devs really wanted this to be a combat focused mechanic, and I mean it is, but I think the response that they saw to that ended up shaping how they came at combat in later titles. I feel like we see a very definitive move towards less resource heavy mechanics in future games to turn the tides of battle. Now, again, if you're watching this, you're probably a very big fan, a hardcore fan. You know there's a lot of ways to get around these resource issues. Jumping out to the world map or transitioning to certain rooms will fully replenish your drive gauge, and there are a bunch of detailed posts on exactly how to use certain abilities to boost your drive gauge back up. So I'm not talking to the like super fans, because I know you guys know how to get your drive form back up and to utilize it in a way that kind of breaks the game. Still though, these drive forms ended up, for a lot of people, being something that they used when they were in danger to change the flow of battle. And this kind of stuck with the iteration of Days and its trump card. I think with Days' limit break mechanic, the devs were taking that change the flow of battle idea and spinning it to be a last resort kind of trump card. I thought about leaving Days out because this is not necessarily a form, and probably stems from KHT's boss design where the org members would use ultimate attacks when their health got to a certain point. I do think though that the design philosophy fits in with how the devs wanted to approach combat. I do want to note that this team was different than the Tokyo team, though I can't imagine them having full reign over development and most likely sourced previous games when looking for inspiration. In KH2 you could trigger drive forms whenever you wanted, though with the auto ability, many probably waited until they were almost dead before popping into a form. In Days, this is kind of echoed, where you had to fall below a certain threshold of health to trigger a special attack. This was incredibly powerful, and as the game progressed, could be pretty spammable. I'm sure this wasn't the intent, but most missions, at least for me, became lose health until you can trigger your limit and take out the enemy. When your limit gauge would deplete, you could just pop limit recharges to recover the gauge. There was also an ability called Limit Boost that increased your gauge, an accessory that would set your HP to 1 and allow you to spam your limit. This was the only game to really focus on this kind of trump card until Rageform brought this Brink of Death mechanic back in KH3. Again, this game was outside of the typical development with a separate team, but I did want to make a note of this game's combat system, since it feels very similar to KH2 in the sense of you would use it when your health got low. Birth by Sleep's command styles though seem to be a direct response to KH2's drive form system. Birth by Sleep introduced command styles. Different forms or styles would trigger depending on what commands you used, which builds up this gauge above your command deck. This trump card moved away from being a last stand kind of mechanic dependent on your HP, and focused more about battle and giving you that edge in battle. If you don't know how command styles work, I'll give a very brief rundown of it. In Birth by Sleep, your command menu, where you can choose between attacking, using magic or items, or summoning, gets switched out with a command deck. You can still attack and summon whenever you want, but your command deck is a customizable deck where you can slot in different attacks, magic, or items that you have in your inventory. As you use commands, it would fill up this gauge at the top, and when it maxed out, you would change into a form. There's actually quite a bit of thought that went into these styles. There was a strategy to it, because if you only attacked and built up your bar, you would just get access to a finisher command. And so you had to use your command deck, right? So it encouraged attacking, or at least using your commands, to shift into these styles that would then change up how you came at the enemy. Each character had specific command styles that boost their natural abilities. Ven styles are focused on quick attacks, Terras are on strong attacks, and Aquas, with kind of a stretch, are focused on distant enemies, since you have dashing attacks that close in on enemies, and some projectile finishers, but really just a very magic focused playstyle. I point out the distant enemies aspect because that seems to be a focus for any magic focused form or attack. Take a look at Wisdom form from KH2 or Element form in KH3, or just like your basic magic in the games. You have projectile-like attacks so you can stay back and strategize with magic. Alongside character-specific command styles, you also have shared styles between characters. You have Blade Charge, which is shared between Aqua and Terra, which is a far-reaching style that deals pretty decent damage. There's also Sky Climber, shared between Aqua and Ven, which focuses on far-reaching quick attacks. There are also Elemental and Final Mix command styles, but I've been talking way too long about this. My main point of bringing up these mechanics is that the idea the devs are going for is building decks centered around each character's abilities and strategizing when to use each one to give yourself an edge in battle. Are you fighting an ice monster? Then pop a fire elemental command style. Fighting a quick monster, use Blade Charge or a far-reaching command style. The main point I want to get across though is that it encouraged battle. right? It encouraged combat because the more that you attacked, the more that your gauge would fill. And it took it away from a resource-focused form, like with the dry forms, to something that was just part of the combat system. So it wasn't detrimental to prioritize getting into these forms because you could just use the commands that you wanted to get the form that you wanted at no extra resource or charge. I think an oversight in this system, and a lot of people who played Birth by Sleep will tell you, is that it locks you in place when you change into a command style. So kind of in an overcorrection to a resource-based gauge, they shifted to something that kind of doesn't let you decide when you do go into that form, right? There were a lot of times where I would let the bar kind of fall down a little bit before I kept attacking because I really didn't want to go into a form or get, frozen in place while I shift and transition. So kind of playing around with that, there was more to command styles than spamming commands, since you had to figure out what style would work and what would be best for the people that you're fighting. And I think Birth by Sleep does a really good job of encouraging that kind of playstyle. Recoded continued the focus on combat with a Keyblade level that unlocked new abilities as you kept attacking. So kind of keeping that same vein of thought as Birth by Sleep, where, the attacks build up a gauge and then you unlock different things and change up your combat, while not having you use a resource or shift away from combat. And so Recoded kind of was similar to Birth by Sleep in the sense that it encouraged you to keep attacking, right, to unlock different levels and change up your combat. It wasn't tied to a resource, right, it was just free, and so it encouraged you to build up those levels quickly, get to a powerful finisher, and then shift back and kind of redo the gameplay cycle again. You can build up to 4 levels, with each Keyblade giving you different abilities that affected the flow of combat. To reach the highest level, you could deal out a powerful finisher. This wouldn't change up your base combo, but would add some special abilities to give you an edge in battle. The gauge for your level would continue to deplete if you stopped attacking, so it would encourage you to keep fighting to unlock more abilities. Just like Days, this was developed by a different team, the main Cage team, but they seem to have some direction and inspiration as Coded continued to build off of the previous iterations of combat. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, right, because it's not really a form, but I did want to kind of show off that throughout all of these titles, there's been a through line of logic. In Kingdom Hearts 2, there was a resource, and the response to that made them shift from a resource-based combat system, right, to something that encouraged you to keep attacking while unlocking new abilities. For whatever reason, this stalled with the next game. Dream Drop Distance saw a return back to the Cage 2 drive gauge mechanic. Instead of having summons and drive forms tied to the same gauge, the devs split them, giving Sora only summons, or limit type of attacks, and Riku only having forms that changes combat. These gauges are connected with your Dream Eaters, who have different limits and forms they can trigger when in the party. Building up the Link gauge requires you to juggle attacks with the Dream Eaters, or hit enemies at the same time. Now, I say this was a return to the Cage 2 drive gauge mechanic, but really it was kind of trying to rework those mechanics, since some things from drive forms were removed. Using a limit or style will not refill your health, and there are not special states that will increase your gauge recharge rate like MP Charge would do in Cage 2. I think the idea was to keep combat as the focus, but to keep it more engaging than matching attack, since the idea was to team up with your Dream Eaters on enemies and trade blows to boost your Link gauge. So you get a boost to how much you recharge if you focus on the enemies that your Dream Eaters were focusing on. Personally, I think this is probably the weakest system. The focus on Dream Eaters unlocking more options felt a little constrictive because you had to rely on synthesis material to create them. It wasn't so much tied to progression as it was to drop rates. Also add to that the difficulty in timing attacks with Dream Eaters and no way to actually increase the duration you were in Link's forms made it hard to feel like you were progressing or growing at all with this ability. So you'd naturally get stronger and stronger abilities, but if you never interacted with the Dream Eater system, you'd never increase or get new forms or abilities. And yes, while that was probably a user error, there wasn't really many systems in place to encourage that. This system didn't seem to land well, and we would get the Situation Command system in Kingdom Hearts 3. The Situation Command system was technically introduced in 0.2 in a beta kind of state, and wouldn't change too much with the iteration we see in Kingdom Hearts 3. The biggest change from 0.2 to 3 was how finishers worked. In 0.2, you actually had to build up another Situation Command before the finisher would become usable. In Kingdom Hearts 3, most of you know that some form changes have a second level, and so the system shifted to have a finisher already ready to go if that was just a 1-level form change, or you'd build up the situation bar to unlock the second level, which would then have a finisher attached to it. The focus for the form change system was trying to broaden the combat system and the flow of combat. Now, people have different opinions on how they went about doing this. It is true with the amount of combat options in Kingdom Hearts 3 that a lot of depth was lost. Due to so many different form changes that all essentially changed up your combos, I think the focus became on creating types of combat housed in playstyles. Each form change is tied with a form. There is Strike form, Element form, Blitz form, and Guardian form. There are also like special forms like Second form, Ultimate form, Double form, which all really just kind of function on their own, and so they aren't really tied to a playstyle. But each of these 4 kind of base forms have a specific focus and special abilities tied to them to encourage a certain playstyle. Strike form has a mega finale just like KH2's Valor form, allowing you to jump straight to your finishers for easy crowd control and dishing out quick hard-hitting damage. Element form has a focus on using magic and has a lot of ranged attacks worked into the form changes, so it incentivizes staying back and picking off enemies. Guardian form is very focused on defensive abilities, having a 360-degree shield, as well as counterattack options and abilities to ensure you keep at least 1 HP from otherwise deadly attacks. Blitz form was all about speed, and so it encouraged you to keep moving while in battle. Honestly, I think the main problem with KH3's combat is not the combat system or the complexity of the combat, but more so its encounter design. And not even the enemy AI for the encounter design, but more so the toolkit that they gave you to deal with enemies. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people that have been able to really show off some incredible tech in this game, so it's not that combat cannot go deep, but more so that there are so many options to choose from that it diluted a lot of the more nuanced and deeper mechanics. A lot of encounters in the base game were easily dealt with by using a finisher from a form change, or really just any option because everything is just so strong in that game. In older titles, really interesting strats were found due to a mix of complex battle systems and difficult encounter design. And with KH3, that kind of wasn't there. This is because, in my opinion, the spectacle and story were the main focus. And again, that's not a bad thing. It's just that the focus for development seemed to be on these big pieces rather than in the encounter design. You can still see a tactical approach with the different forms having different abilities. I believe the developers at first just had a different idea of how they wanted the game to feel, but had to cut the scope back. Like, I can see the bones of a really in-depth battle system, where you're holding on to different form changes and pulling them out to deal with very specific instances, but I think either due to time constraints or it just being too big of a scope, the encounter design and combat flow was dialed back. I mean, when you're all leveled up, it doesn't really change your playstyle up too much to shift between form changes, and most people will just choose whichever form change they find the most fun. Not to say that this is a bad decision, but I can understand why some people were less than impressed. And so I feel like the focus at one point was this diverse, very complex battle system, which we can still see the remnants of in the game, but then the focus shifted to kind of set pieces and style. What I think KH3 did well though is keeping the flow of combat. KH2 had a really good drive system, but tying it to a resource kept it locked down. Birth by Sleep followed up on this by having you naturally go into your forms through combat. There was also some strategy involved depending on what form you wanted, and how you wanted to deal with the mobs in front of you. The response to this though was some frustration at times when you would be locked in place when you form changed. This is addressed in KH3 where you still build up a bar through combat, but you can hold on to that and use it when you need to. Add to the fact that you could hold 3 Keyblades with 3 different styles of combat, which would help you plan to deal with multiple types of threats. It's honestly kind of blending triggering a drive form when you need it from KH2 and the combat flow of Birth by Sleep into a fusion of the two. KH3 even took the second chance type of mechanic from KH2 drive forms and innovated it a bit. Rage form was your form change that could appear when you were low on HP. You could heal up and also have a pretty strong form that you were locked out of your commands, and if you want to get out of the form quickly, you'd have to tank your HP with the situation commands or get lucky enough to have a team attack or attraction flow trigger. I've kind of harped on it, so you know this at this point, but there's a very logical flow that you can follow from KH2 onwards, and I hope that I've showcased here where the developers really wanted to prioritize combat flow. Not to take you out of combat, but to enhance it. Due to the response from KH3, I'm interested to see what the developers do with Kingdom Hearts 4. I still stand by the fact that I think Kingdom Hearts 3 did some really interesting things, where there was a lot of innovation and creativity to have different types of combat appearing throughout all the different form changes, which were tied to certain forms that inherently had a specific strategy to them. The trouble came where this complexity kind of wasn't needed. The encounter design of Kingdom Hearts 3 in the base game didn't need complex combat. I think this really isn't just a problem with Kingdom Hearts 3 though. I think the gaming industry in general has shifted in focus, wanting to have a casual experience be the most important thing to keep up with the speed at which the gaming industry puts out games and the dwindling life cycles of games in general. being on YouTube and making content for Kingdom Hearts 3, even like looking back at KH3 up to now, the speed at which people take in games and play with games and experiment and explore is exponentially lower today. I mean, if you look at Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the life cycle of those two games is insane. I know for a fact that Rebirth has so much packed into it, and I never saw anybody talk about it. And that might just be like the circle of people that I'm around, but like the way that people talked about Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake and games that were coming out at that time, the life cycle of those games lasted so much longer than they do now. And I think if you look at Birth by Sleep, Kingdom Hearts 2, the life cycle of those games was exponentially larger than what Kingdom Hearts 3 had. And so I think it makes sense that for a lot of games, not just Kingdom Hearts 3, but a lot of games now prioritize the casual experience, right? Getting through a game quickly and having fun and having a lot of spectacle is a lot more important to developers than having a challenging or complex encounter design. So, sorry for my spiel. Getting back to Kingdom Hearts 3, really only the most dedicated of players stay behind to test these things and play around with the mechanics. And I mean, there are some amazing showcases of Kingdom Hearts 3's combat, utilizing the different combos from Formchanges and just the combat system in general. So this game feels like it's almost at odds with itself, where the combat design and the general game design don't really match each other. Sorry about that, I didn't mean to like jump into like a whole like meta narrative or meta analysis of the gaming industry, but I feel like that's why, even though Kingdom Hearts 3 was really innovative with its combat system, the encounter design and general game philosophy kind of dampered and hurt that. Now, I want to briefly touch on Kingdom Hearts 4 as we talk about what could potentially be the next steps we see in terms of combat design in this title. The only thing we know about a potential form system in Kingdom Hearts 4 is the scrap and build system that has been discussed briefly in interviews. Now, it's hard to extrapolate any information from that brief interview moment and the KH4 trailer due to it being such an early look at the game. There are many times where an early look at a game is kind of not really exactly what it ends up being. So I do want to take everything I say here with a grain of salt. I know personally I would love to see them dig more into the combat, but in a way that complements the game design. I really believe KH3 was on a good path with its combat, and I hope that the gameplay for KH4 is taken and built upon the older games rather than backtracking to KH2 game design. It's not that I hate KH2, but I think there were some good innovations to the combat system since that game, and I'd rather see the actual game design shift as the developers continue to push forward and innovate. What I would hate to see is shifting back to old systems because it's either nostalgic or comfortable for veteran players instead of, trying to push that system farther forward. I think what I would like to see is a system that tightens up the different forms. I think having specific forms like strike form or element form is a really good idea, but the actual strategy can be tightened up to make it very apparent what they should be used for and what they shouldn't. I think every form or attack for that matter being good at decimating mobs or bosses is not good game design, and having specialties would be great. There are times in KH2 or Birth by Sleep where I'd actively choose a certain form because I thought, yeah, this would be a good one to use for this situation. I did this for KH3 on harder difficulties, but for the most part, you can use any form change and be okay. Everything is homogenized. So I guess my biggest wish for Kingdom Hearts 4's combat design, whatever that may be, is that it individualizes the system again while keeping the same innovation towards keeping that flow of combat feeling good. While this part where Sword creates a drill as a reaction command, I do like this idea of drawing upon the enemy to create unique weapons. The idea that I have is kind of similar to Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise. I don't know if you guys have played that, but damaging an enemy, stunning it, and then drawing upon them to do a finisher type of move might be a really fun system to explore in Kingdom Hearts 4. It might be really creative and unique to be able to create weapons and attacks while not completely pulling us away from the hack and slash flow that we're all used to with the Keyblade. It'd be similar to the situation command system where you're building up damage, but instead of you building up the gauge yourself, right, you're kind of whittling away the defense of your enemy. And then also tying in that really fun reaction command system would just be a blend of both worlds. If we believe the command menu in this teaser, we do have a dedicated build option, so to me, that does tell me they have a vision for an option where we build specific things. We have a pipe dream of building weapons from the Final Fantasy series and taking on the jobs we see in those games like Dragoon, Paladin, Dark Knight, stuff like that, where we take on a specialized stance that provides specific benefits like a defensive form, a strength form, or other forms like we have seen in previous games. But all of that's kind of getting into theory crafting and a little bit of rambling. I hope you found this interesting. I love looking at combat, as you probably know, and so doing a meta breakdown in Kingdom Hearts as a whole was really fun. I hope I was able to showcase how the combat has changed and evolved throughout the titles, and I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this, you might like my more granular videos diving into the different forms of Kingdom Hearts, or if you like this longer format kind of video where I talk a lot, I have a series diving into the psychology of different characters. Check them out, you might like them. Also, I just want to plug myself. If you enjoy my content, it greatly helps me out if you become a Patreon member or YouTube member. There are links in the description below. You can pledge as little as $1, and genuinely you have no idea how much that helps me. I do work outside of this, but if I could, make this a more full-time thing, or be able to maybe hire people more full-time to get videos out faster, that would be so incredible. It would be so awesome. So if you want to, consider helping me out. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you want to share it with somebody you think will like it, let me know your thoughts down below. Do you agree with my kind of thesis of the main focus of combat for Kingdom Hearts, or do you have a different idea on it? I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.